Hi guys, and welcome to the third lesson of our Geographies of Conflict unit. Today's lesson will focus on what the causes of conflict are. As usual, your task for this lesson will be to watch this video and answer any questions as instructed. At the end of the video, there is a review task which you will be required to complete and upload onto Satchel 1. So before we crack on with this lesson now, I do want to go over a quick recap. So in our first lesson of this unit, we were looking at the definitions of conflict, and we decided that conflict was a serious disagreement, usually over a long period of time between people or countries as well. And war is an example of conflict, only this time war is armed conflict. So for a conflict to be classed as a war, that conflict has to be armed. Now, there are lots and lots of conflicts that occur between countries every single day, but not all conflicts lead to war. In fact, the majority are ended peacefully. And going beyond that definition, most wars don't end up on the scale of things like World War One or World War Two. They tend to be a lot more localized within a country or within a few countries, as opposed to tens or even hundreds of countries across the world. And so what we then looked at in lesson 2 was we looked at this idea that conflicts have changed over time. And so in terms of the number of conflicts, there was a large increase up until 1991, at which point the Cold War ended, and as the Cold War ended, the number of conflicts started to reduce dramatically. The same thing can be said of refugee numbers. So a refugee is a person who has been forced to leave their country due to war. So if there is a Syrian refugee, their entire town, village may have been destroyed by war in that country, and therefore, in order to have some quality of life or access to basic human rights, they become a refugee and they seek refuge in another country or another area. And then finally, we look at this idea of state fragility, and the concept here is that some states are very fragile. They are very close to breaking and conflict then occurring. So there's a lot of places in Central Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, there's a lot of places in Asia as well, where there's a very high chance in the future that because they're so fragile, a conflict might end up occurring there. And so today then, we've learned a little bit about definitions, we've learned about some examples as well. But the question I have is, well, what actually causes international conflict? Now, there are two questions here. If you have a pen and some paper, that would be ideal. What I'd like to do is to pause this video, have a read, and try to jot down some ideas for those two questions there. So what causes war or armed conflict to occur, and what may countries end up fighting for? Okay, so pause the video here, have a quick jot down of those two questions, taking about a minute each, and unpause once you've had a go. Okay, hopefully you've had a go at those two questions. So what causes war or armed conflict to occur? We're going to look at that today. And what may countries end up fighting for? I'm obviously pre-guessing here. You might be talking about resources. You might be talking about freedom. You might be talking about what's right as well. If you think about World War II, for example, a large part of it was stopping the Nazis, for example. It may be for safety, it may be for your family, etc. There's lots of reasons why wars break out, but today we're going to focus on three main ones, and those are as follows. They're going to be territorial disputes, conflict over resources, and something called ethnicity. Now, the word ethnicity you may not have come across before. We'll look over that. Resources we have already looked at in terms of the Arctic. I'm going to recap that. In territory disputes, if you're still unsure what that word means, a territory is like a landmass. So, for example, Britain has any land in Britain. So you have a land around Liverpool, London is British territory. Any islands we have at the Isle of Man, Guernsey, etc., are all territories of Britain. And all countries have territory which they claim. And all these three things do cause conflict on an international level. And so we'll start off with the first one, which is territorial disputes. So generically, the problem we have here is that even though we have world maps, not all land is peaceful, has been decided upon by those countries. So the way to think about this is that some countries actually believe that land that belongs to another country is theirs. Some of them might believe that land that belongs to a neighbouring country historically should be theirs, or by right should be theirs. And the way to think about this is maybe if there was a garden that you shared with a neighbour, and the neighbour maybe took a small plot of land 50 years ago, you might have a dispute now that you are the real owner of that land, even though they've had it for a long time. And this happens quite a lot in geography, because a lot of our borders that we've drawn on maps do not take into account these disputes. And on a global scale, these are happening an awful amount of time. This map here is showing the border disputes worldwide, and every country in red has had some kind of border dispute in 2017 onwards. And that is a huge, huge proportion of the earth. Britain is involved in that. We're having issues with Spain over the Isles of Gibraltar. America, Canada, most of Africa, most of Asia, Australia, Latin America. All these countries are having disputes. Now, the key here is not all of this will end in armed conflict. Britain and Spain, for example, have not ended up in armed conflict over territorial disputes. And that is the case in the vast majority. But some of them do end up escalating quite dramatically. One of the key examples I can think of is this happened this year. Now, this article was in 2020 in June. There's been a recent one as well. And India and China have an ongoing territorial dispute. And that hit a flashpoint in 2020 when 20 Indian troops were actually killed in fighting. So the territorial dispute got that intense that both China and India started firing along the border, and 20 people ended up being killed in that dispute. And the reason for that is over these small pockets of land here. Now, China and India are both absolutely huge countries, but the problem they have is that at their border it is disputed. So you can see the little pink line here is where the disputed border is, and the kind of shaded orange and yellow is where the territory is disputed. So if India and China feel they have right over these territories here, and if obviously they both can't have them, and so conflict has ensued. And historically, a large cause of conflict has been because of territory disputes. And usually, those territory disputes are for a more sinister reason, because it's all about accessing resources. Resources like water, resources like oil, resources like gold, precious minerals, etc. And usually, those disputes are all to do with the idea that those countries want that land because within that land there is lots of resources. And we've actually already looked at this before. When we did our Arctic topic, we were looking at this concept of oil being found in the Arctic. And one of the maps we looked at the time in the lesson was that, for example, the coasts of Greenland are very rich in oil. In fact, the Arctic is one of the areas of the world which has the largest, as yet undiscovered reserves of oil and gas. And oil and gas are very, very valuable resources. And so in the Arctic, what we looked at in the lesson was this map here, and it showed that lots of different countries, the US, Russia, Canada, Denmark, are all going to be trying to claim these resources. And you can see in the little red and green dots where these oil fields are. And these claims overlap. And a lot of conflict occurs when two countries believe they should have a resource. So, for example, if both Russia and Norway claim one of these future gas or oil fields, the other one might not agree, and that is where we have our conflict. Okay, because a lot of them will want it, and usually there is a legal right, but in some cases there is not always a legal right to certain types of resources, and therefore it might lead to escalating or armed conflict. Water is another really good example, where in some countries that find it difficult to access water, there is conflict over who uses that water, where they get it from as well. And so the final reason we'll look at is something called ethnicity. Now, an ethnic group or ethnicity is a very strange term, but basically it's a grouping of people that identify with each other on shared attributes. They might have common traditions, common language, common history, society, culture, religion within their area. So, for example, if you've ever been on a survey, it sometimes asks for your ethnic group. And I, for example, on that form would put white British. And that means that generically people within that ethnic group would have very similar traditions. So we would have a similar tradition of have like a roast dinner on a weekend or go to church on a Sunday. We'd all speak a similar language. Our ancestry would be similar. So we might, between that ethnic group, there'd be Saxon, Viking ancestry, etc. Similar society, similar religion. And that's in our country usually isn't a huge source of conflict. There is some, but it's not a huge source. The problems occur when one group is disadvantaged over the other. So let's say, for example, we have a country that has two main ethnic groups. One ethnic group is the ethnic group that makes up the majority of the government, an ethnic group that makes up the majority of the police force, an ethnic group that makes up the vast majority of the high-paying jobs. Then you have another ethnic group within that country that is the complete opposite. There's more in poverty, they don't have a job in the government, they don't have any role in politics. And so when that happens, we tend to have conflict because the ones that are disadvantaged, that group, don't like it. And so they start to rebel. They start to cause a fuss about it. And this has happened all around the world. And a really big example was in Bosnia in the 1990s. Now, I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but ethnic tension was largely blamed for the conflict in this country. And if we look at this map here, you can get some idea why. So this was Bosnia-Herzegovina, which is a country that doesn't now exists, but before it didn't exist. And essentially, you can see here that within that country, there were lots of different ethnic groups. Those colours like the blue, the green, the yellow, and the red are showing different ethnicities. Now, in this war, in this conflict, the problem was that some of the ethnicities were being treated differently to others. They're being disproportionately targeted, and there was violence against them as well. And it ended up with something called ethnic cleansing, which is basically a term for trying to get rid of an ethnic group. So they were trying to kill them, trying to remove them from the country. In this case, it was the Bosnian Muslim population. And so ethnic groups and the differences between them have led to huge numbers of conflicts around the world. So just to kind of recap that then, guys, there are three main ways or three causes of international conflict: territorial dispute, resources, and ethnicity. My advice would always be, if this interests you, there is a plethora, there is loads and loads of resources that you can look at outside this lesson. There are literally thousands of examples of territorial disputes, of ethnic group disputes across the world. And this is kind of a snapshot, as it were, looking at them. And so this week for your review task is a little bit different. Rather than the three questions, I've asked you to do one extended question. And that question is, explain the human and physical causes of conflict. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to write that question and then answer it. To answer that question, it should be at least 2 or 3 paragraphs long. And to answer it, you need to include the 3 factors we have looked at during the lesson today. You should give information about them. So say what a territorial dispute is, and then explain how they cause conflict, or give examples of how they can cause conflict. And if you do that for each of the 3 factors, you will answer this question effectively. As always, any questions, there will be live Zoom support. And additionally, you can ask questions on Chapter 1 if you need to.